What would you do if you built an empire from the ground up, only to be betrayed by your own team and fired from your own company? This CEO went undercover to fix what he thought was a broken system, only to discover the corruption ran deeper than he ever imagined. But what he did next? No one saw it coming. Stay tuned, because this shocking story of betrayal, redemption, and one man's fight for justice will leave you speechless. Tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will leave you speechless. The boardroom was silent. Ethan Hayes sat at the back, unnoticed. He wore a simple uniform, blending in like any other employee. His heart pounded as he stared at the polished table. Around him, executives whispered to each other. All eyes were on Victoria Kane, the COO. Victoria spoke with calm confidence. "This company needs strong leadership," she said. Her words were sharp, and every sentence cut deeper. "We cannot move forward with the current direction." Ethan felt his chest tighten. He knew what was coming. Victoria continued, her tone firm. "For the good of the company, I propose we remove Ethan Hayes as CEO." The room froze. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He scanned the faces of the board members. Most avoided his gaze. A few looked grim but determined. These were people he had trusted for years. Now they sat silent, their loyalty gone. The vote was quick, unanimous. Ethan Hayes was officially out. His company was no longer his. Ethan gripped the edges of his chair. His mind raced, but he couldn't react. Not here, not now. Months ago he had decided to go undercover. He wanted to see the cracks in his company. He wanted to understand his employees' struggles. But now his plan felt like a mistake. Everything was falling apart. As the meeting ended, the board members filed out. They muttered to each other in low voices. Victoria stayed behind for a moment. She scanned the room with a faint smile. Her gaze stopped on Ethan. Her eyes narrowed as if she sensed something. He kept his head low. She didn't linger and soon walked away, heels clicking on the floor. Ethan sat still, his hands shaking. His company, his life's work, all gone. Anger bubbled inside him, but guilt followed close behind. Maybe this was his fault. Maybe he had been blind to the problems. He thought of the workers he had met while undercover. Maya, always tired but kind. Luis, the janitor with wise advice. Ryan, the sharp intern who hated the system. Their struggles replayed in his mind. But this wasn't over. It couldn't be. He stood slowly, his mind racing with thoughts. He had learned so much in the past months. He had seen what was broken. Now he had to decide what to do next. As he walked out of the boardroom, his heart was heavy. But his resolve was strong. This was only the beginning. Ethan walked through the hallways of the corporate building, his footsteps soft on the tiled floor. The walls, lined with framed awards and glossy photos of past achievements, seemed to mock him. Each plaque bore his name, Ethan Hayes, visionary leader. He averted his eyes. The weight of those titles felt hollow now. Downstairs, the atmosphere was different. The factory floor buzzed with life. Machines roared, metal clanged, and workers moved quickly, their faces tired but focused. The air smelled of oil and sweat, thick with the hum of labor. Ethan slipped into the crowd, blending in with the workers who barely noticed him. This had become his life, quiet observation from the shadows. Maya was at her usual station, assembling parts with practiced speed. Her hands moved deftly, but her eyes looked strained. Ethan approached her casually, careful not to draw attention. "Long shift today?" he asked, keeping his tone light. She glanced at him and gave a tired smile. "Aren't they all?" she replied, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "But I've got rent to pay, so here I am." Ethan hesitated, unsure how to respond. He had learned over the past months that Maya carried a lot on her shoulders. She was a single mom working 2 jobs, barely scraping by. Yet she never complained. At least, not openly. "Anything new from management?" Ethan asked carefully, keeping his words vague. Maya's smile faded. "The usual nonsense. Quotas are up, but they're cutting corners again. Safety doesn't matter as long as the numbers look good. Someone's going to get hurt." Her words struck him harder than he expected. He had heard similar complaints from others, but hearing it now, after everything that had just happened in the boardroom, made his stomach churn. This wasn't just a failing system, it was a failing him. Ethan nodded, pretending to understand without revealing too much. "Thanks for the heads up," he said quietly. Luis appeared behind him, pushing his cart of cleaning supplies. The older man wiped his forehead with a rag, then chuckled when he saw Ethan. "You still look too clean to work here," Luis joked, his voice warm despite the teasing. Ethan forced a smile. "Guess I've got to try harder." Luis leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You hear about the accident last week? Nearly lost a guy on Machine 6. They're patching it up with duct tape again. Management doesn't care. They're up there counting money while we're down here risking lives." Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew Luis wasn't exaggerating. He had seen the reports while undercover, the hidden files showing just how far some supervisors went to cut costs. But hearing it from Luis made it real. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, they were people. "Someone needs to call them out," Luis continued, his tone bitter. "But nobody down here has that kind of power." Ethan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He wanted to tell Luis he was wrong. He wanted to say, "I have that power. I can fix this." But he couldn't, not yet. The loudspeaker crackled overhead, interrupting his thoughts. "Attention, all employees, mandatory meeting in the break room in 10 minutes. Maya groaned. What now? Another speech about productivity? Luis sighed and shook his head. It's never good news. Ethan followed them toward the break room, his mind racing. Whatever this meeting was about, it felt like another piece of the puzzle he was trying to solve. As they crowded into the small space, he kept to the back, listening closely. A supervisor stepped forward, clipboard in hand, and began speaking. The announcement was exactly what Ethan had feared. New quotas, shorter deadlines, zero mention of improving safety. The workers muttered under their breath, frustration rippling through the room. Maya clenched her fists, and Luis shook his head in disgust. Ethan felt the weight of their anger and hopelessness pressing down on him. He had caused this, indirectly perhaps, but it was still his company, his policies, his failure. As the meeting ended, Ethan slipped out quietly. He couldn't bear to look at their faces anymore. Outside, the cool evening air hit him like a slap, but it did little to calm his swirling thoughts. He needed a plan. Fast. This wasn't just about getting his company back, it was about fixing everything he had broken. But how could he fight back when the people closest to him had already turned against him? Ethan stared at the glowing city skyline in the distance. He wasn't sure yet, but one thing was clear. He couldn't do it alone. Ethan walked the streets late into the evening, his mind spinning with questions and plans. The city around him was alive, cars honking, people laughing, neon signs flashing in the distance, but he felt utterly alone. His disguise had cut him off from everything familiar. He couldn't go to his old allies, and he couldn't risk exposing himself to the workers he had come to respect. The weight of his dual life pressed heavily on his chest. He stopped at a small diner on the edge of the industrial district. The place was quiet, with cracked vinyl booths and the faint smell of burnt coffee. Ethan slid into a corner booth, his back to the wall, and ordered a coffee he didn't want. He needed time to think, but the thoughts wouldn't come in order. Every problem felt tangled with another. The door jingled behind him as someone entered. Ethan glanced up instinctively and froze. It was Ryan, the sharp-tongued intern who had always seemed suspicious of him. Ryan looked around the diner, spotted Ethan, and hesitated. Then, without waiting for an invitation, he walked over and slid into the seat across from him. "Fancy seeing you here," Ryan said. his tone laced with sarcasm. He set his phone down on the table, leaning back with his arms crossed. Or should I say, Mr. Hayes? Ethan's blood ran cold. His hand gripped the edge of the table as he tried to keep his face neutral. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice steady but low. Ryan smirked, tapping his phone. Save it. I know who you are. Took me a while to piece it together, but you're not as invisible as you think. The way you ask questions, the way you listen, too careful, too calculated, you're not one of us. You're him. Ethan didn't respond, his mind scrambling for a way out. Denying it seemed pointless, but admitting the truth felt like a trap. Relax, Ryan said, his tone softening slightly. I'm not going to rat you out, not yet anyway, but I've got to ask, why? Why the hell are you down there pretending to be one of us? What's your game? Ethan sighed, leaning back in his seat. There was no point in lying now. I wanted to understand, he said quietly. I wanted to see what I was missing. What went wrong? Ryan raised an eyebrow. And? What did you figure out, boss? That I failed, Ethan admitted, his voice heavy with regret. I let this place become something I never wanted it to be. People are suffering because I was too focused on profits and growth. I thought I could fix it if I just saw it for myself. Ryan studied him for a moment, his sharp eyes narrowing. Well, congratulations. You've got a front row seat to the mess you made. But what are you actually going to do about it? Ethan hesitated. He didn't have an answer. Not yet. Ryan leaned forward, lowering his voice. Look, I don't like you. I don't trust you. But if you're serious about fixing this, you're going to need help. The board's got their claws in deep, and people like Victoria aren't just going to roll over because you feel bad. Ethan frowned. And you're offering to help me? Ryan shrugged. I'm offering to keep your secret, for now. But if you want me on your side, you'd better prove you're not just another suit playing games. Do something real. Ethan stared at him, the weight of the moment sinking in. Ryan was right. Words weren't enough. If he wanted to earn the trust of the people he had let down, he needed to act. And fast. What do you have in mind? Ethan asked cautiously. Ryan smirked. I've got a few ideas. But first, you're going to need to get your hands dirty. No more sitting on the sidelines, boss. Ethan nodded slowly, the faintest spark of hope flickering inside him. He wasn't sure where this new alliance would lead, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he wasn't completely alone. As they left the diner, the city light seemed a little less cold. Ethan didn't know what the next step would be, but he knew one thing for certain. He was ready to fight. And this time, he wouldn't back down. The following morning, Ethan arrived at the factory floor with a renewed sense of focus. The din of machines roared around him, and the smell of oil and metal filled the air. Workers moved about in tired, practiced motions, their faces set in quiet determination. Ethan scanned the room until he found Maya and Luis near their stations. He felt a pang of guilt as he approached them, knowing that every problem here traced back to him. Hey, Ethan said casually, stepping beside Luis, who was wiping grease off a lever. Anything new? Luis sighed, shaking his head. Same old. They want more output with less time. Machine 6's patch isn't holding, and it's only a matter of time before it breaks down again. He glanced at Ethan, his brows furrowing. You're always asking questions. Why? What are you trying to figure out? Before Ethan could respond, Maya joined them, her hands on her hips. Probably the same thing we're all trying to figure out. How to survive another day without losing a limb, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Ethan managed a weak smile. Maybe I just care about what's happening. Maya raised an eyebrow. Care? That's rich. Nobody upstairs cares about what happens down here. We're numbers to them. Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. He couldn't reveal the truth yet, not like this. Instead, he nodded. Maybe it's time someone did. Maya frowned, clearly unconvinced, but Luis chuckled softly. Well, if you're volunteering to be our savior, you've got a hell of a job ahead of you." Their conversation was cut short by the sharp blare of an alarm. All heads turned toward the far end of the factory floor, where Machine 6 had started to shudder violently. Sparks flew from its base, and the grinding sound of metal against metal filled the air. "Shut it down!" someone yelled, but the machine kept groaning, its internal gears straining under the pressure. Workers scrambled to clear the area, but Ethan ran toward the machine. Without thinking, he grabbed the emergency shutoff lever and yanked it with all his strength. The machine groaned one last time before falling silent, a plume of smoke rising from its vents. The room was quiet for a moment, save for the heavy breathing of the workers nearby. Maya stared at Ethan, her eyes wide. "Are you insane?" she demanded. "You could have been killed." Ethan straightened, his hands shaking from the adrenaline. Someone had to do it. Luis approached the machine, inspecting the damage. "This thing's a death trap. We've told management a dozen times it needs replacing, but they don't listen." Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. "They will now." Maya crossed her arms, glaring at him. "And what makes you think they'll listen to us? They never do." Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. He knew Maya was right. The board didn't care about the workers, and neither did most of the supervisors. But he couldn't let this slide, not after what he had seen. "I'll handle it," Ethan said firmly. Maya laughed bitterly. "Sure you will. You and what army?" Luis placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression thoughtful. "Let him try. Can't hurt to have someone on our side for once." Ethan nodded, grateful for Luis's support. "Just trust me," he said quietly. "I'll make them listen." As the workers returned to their stations, Ethan slipped away, his mind buzzing with plans. He knew he needed to act quickly if he wanted to make a difference. Ryan's words echoed in his head. Do something real. That evening, Ethan met Ryan in a dimly lit corner of a local bar. Ryan was already nursing a beer, his eyes scanning the room as if expecting trouble. When Ethan sat down, Ryan leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I heard about what happened with the machine," Ryan said. "Word travels fast." "It's worse than I thought," Ethan admitted. "That machine should have been replaced months ago. Someone's going to get hurt if we don't fix this." Ryan smirked. "Welcome to the real world, boss. This is what happens when profits come before people." Ethan ignored the jab. "We need proof, something we can take to the board. If we can show them how bad it's gotten, they won't be able to ignore it." Ryan leaned back, considering this. "You want proof? I can get you proof, but it's risky. You sure you're ready to get your hands dirty?" Ethan met his gaze, his expression resolute. "I don't have a choice." Ryan nodded slowly. "All right then, meet me tomorrow night. And bring your courage. You're going to need it." Ethan left the bar with a sense of grim determination. He had spent too long sitting on the sidelines, watching his company fall apart. It was time to fight back. No more hiding, no more waiting. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. The factory floor was quiet when Ethan slipped in after hours. The dim emergency lights cast long shadows across the rows of dormant machines. The usual hum of activity was replaced by an eerie stillness. Ethan's footsteps echoed faintly as he made his way toward the back corner where Ryan had told him to meet. His heart pounded harder with every step. Ryan appeared out of the shadows, his phone's flashlight flickering, as he waved Ethan over. "Took you long enough," he muttered, his voice low. He glanced around to ensure they were alone before motioning toward a small maintenance door. "Come on, this is where they keep the logs." Ethan hesitated for a moment. "Logs?" Ryan gave him a look. "Maintenance logs, safety reports, everything they've been burying to cover their asses. You want proof? This is it." Ethan nodded and followed him. They slipped through the door into a cramped office space lined with filing cabinets and shelves of binders. Dust hung thick in the air, and the faint smell of grease lingered. Ryan handed Ethan a pair of gloves. "If anyone asks, we didn't touch a thing." The two of them worked quickly, sifting through documents under the glow of Ryan's flashlight. Ethan's fingers trembled as he flipped through stacks of papers detailing years of neglected maintenance. Reports about Machine 6 jumped out at him, warnings about worn-out parts, recommendations to replace entire systems, all ignored in favor of cheaper patchwork fixes. "This is worse than I thought," Ethan murmured, holding up a faded report marked urgent. Ryan leaned over, glancing at the paper. "They've been sitting on this for months, maybe longer. And that's just one machine." Ethan's jaw clenched. He thought he had seen the worst of it, but the evidence in front of him painted a much darker picture. Workers' complaints weren't just ignored, they were actively buried. Injuries were downplayed, accidents reclassified as minor incidents, all to protect the company's image. Ryan pulled out a thick binder labeled Incident Reports. "This is the gold mine," he said, flipping through the pages. "We take this to the board, and they won't have a leg to stand on." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. "This isn't just about the board. This is about the people down there risking their lives every day. They deserve better." Ryan smirked. "Careful, boss. You're starting to sound like one of us." Ethan didn't respond. He was too focused on the gravity of what they were uncovering. For years, he had been blind to the suffering happening right under his nose. Now he couldn't look away. Suddenly, the faint sound of voices drifted through the air. Ethan froze, his heart lurching. Ryan snapped off the flashlight, plunging them into darkness. "Someone's coming," Ryan whispered, his voice tense. "We need to move." Ethan grabbed the binder and tucked it under his arm. Ryan stuffed a handful of loose papers into his jacket. Together, they slipped out of the office and into the shadows of the factory floor. The voices grew louder, supervisors by the sound of it. Flashlights bobbed in the distance as the men patrolled the area. Ethan and Ryan crouched behind a stack of crates, their breathing shallow. Ethan's mind raced. If they were caught, everything would fall apart. The disguise, the plan, the proof. It would all be over. The flashlights swept closer, their beams cutting through the darkness. Ryan nudged Ethan, pointing toward a side door near the edge of the room. It was their only way out. Ethan nodded, his pulse hammering in his ears. The two of them moved slowly, keeping low and silent. Every step felt agonizingly loud in the stillness. The flashlights passed dangerously close, but the crates shielded them from view. Finally, they reached the door. Ryan eased it open, and they slipped outside into the cool night air. Ethan exhaled sharply, his chest tight with relief. Ryan leaned against the wall, grinning despite the close call. "Not bad for your first heist," he said, clearly amused by Ethan's tension. Ethan shook his head, clutching the binder to his chest. "This isn't a joke. If they catch wind of what we've got—" "They won't," Ryan interrupted, his tone serious now. "Not if we move fast." Ethan nodded, steeling himself. They had what they needed. Now it was time to use it. "Tomorrow," Ethan said firmly, his voice resolute. "We confront them tomorrow." Ryan's grin returned. "You sure about that, boss? Because once you pull this trigger, there's no going back." Ethan met his gaze, his expression hard. "I've already lost everything. I've got nothing left to lose." Ryan nodded, satisfied. "Then let's burn it all down." As they walked away from the factory, the city loomed ahead, its lights flickering like a distant promise. For the first time, Ethan felt the weight of action bearing down on him. The fight ahead would be messy, dangerous, and full of uncertainty. But it was the only way forward, and he was ready. The next morning, the tension in the air was almost suffocating. Ethan woke early, his mind replaying the events from the night before. The binder sat on the small desk in his rented room, its edges worn and corners frayed. Inside it held more than reports. It held the truth, the kind of truth that could bring a company to its knees. Ethan stared at it for a moment, his stomach tight with anxiety, before packing it carefully into his bag. Today was the day he stopped being a bystander. Ryan was already waiting for him outside the diner they'd been using as a meeting spot. He leaned casually against the wall, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, but his sharp eyes betrayed his nerves. "You ready for this?" Ryan asked as Ethan approached. "Not really," Ethan admitted, pulling the strap of his bag tighter over his shoulder. "But we don't have a choice." Ryan nodded. "Good answer. Let's do this." Together they made their way to the factory. The day shift was in full swing, with workers bustling about, their faces focused and weary. Ethan's heart ached as he passed them. Maya was at her station, carefully assembling components while sparing worried glances toward Machine 6. Luis was nearby, mopping up oil from the floor. Neither of them looked up as Ethan and Ryan slipped past and headed for the supervisor's office. Inside, the supervisor, a stern man named Mr. Gleason, sat behind his desk, shuffling papers. His face was etched with years of stress and cynicism, and his sharp eyes narrowed as soon as Ethan and Ryan entered. "What's this about?" Gleason asked, barely glancing up. Ethan placed the binder on the desk with a deliberate thud. "This is about the truth," he said, his voice steady but firm. Gleason raised an eyebrow, finally looking at the binder. "And what truth is that?" Ryan stepped forward, crossing his arms. "The truth you've been hiding. Years of ignored safety violations, buried incident reports, and warnings that could have saved lives. All covered up to protect the bottom line." Gleason's expression darkened. He leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what you're talking about. Those reports are confidential. You have no business digging through them." Ethan didn't flinch. "You're right. I had no business letting this happen in the first place, but it did, and now it's going to stop." Gleason's eyes darted between them, suspicion flickering across his face. "Who are you to make demands? What exactly are you trying to accomplish here?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, then made his decision. Slowly, he reached up and pulled off the plain work cap he'd been wearing, revealing himself fully. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to make Gleason's eyes widen in shock. "My name is Ethan Hayes," he said firmly, "and this is my company, or at least it was." Gleason's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He blinked, clearly struggling to process what he'd just heard. After a beat, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "If you're trying to blackmail me, you're making a mistake. This company doesn't belong to you anymore." "I'm not here to blackmail anyone," Ethan replied, his tone unwavering. "I'm here to fix what I broke." Ryan stepped in, slapping his hand on the binder. "And you're going to help, or this whole thing blows wide open, starting with the board." Gleason looked from Ethan to Ryan, his face pale. For a moment it seemed like he might resist, but then his shoulders slumped, and he let out a heavy sigh. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice laced with defeat. "Call an emergency meeting with the board," Ethan said. "Today, I'll take it from there." Hours later, the boardroom was full again. The same sleek table, the same cold stares from the executives who had voted Ethan out just days ago. Victoria Kane sat at the head of the table, her polished confidence intact. When Ethan walked in, the room fell silent. Victoria's lips curled into a mocking smile. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone dripping with false politeness, "to what do we owe this unexpected visit?" Ethan set the binder down on the table, mirroring the same deliberate thud he'd made in Gleason's office. "To show you what's really been happening under your leadership," he said calmly. Victoria arched an eyebrow. "And what exactly do you think you're going to prove?" Ethan opened the binder, pulling out one of the most damning reports, a detailed account of how Machine 6's malfunctions had been ignored for over a year. "This is just one example," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "There are dozens more, safety violations, negligence, injuries that could have been avoided, all swept under the rug to save a few dollars." The room was silent. Some of the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats while others exchanged worried glances. Victoria, however, remained unfazed. "Even if this is true," she said, her tone dismissive, "what exactly do you plan to do about it? You no longer have the authority to make decisions here." Ethan straightened, meeting her gaze head-on. "I don't need authority to tell the truth. And if you think this stays in this room, you're wrong. The workers know, the public will know, and once they do, this company's reputation will be destroyed." Victoria's smile faltered for the first time. Her eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward slightly. "You're bluffing." Ryan stepped forward, holding up his phone. "Actually, we're not. Copies of these reports are already being uploaded as we speak. We've got whistleblowers ready to go public. You can try to stop it, but it's too late." Victoria's expression turned icy, and her fists clenched against the table. She glanced around at the other board members, some of whom were visibly panicked. It was clear the tide was turning. Ethan leaned in, his voice low but firm. "You have two choices. Work with me to fix this, or watch everything fall apart." The room fell into a tense silence. Victoria's jaw tightened, and she sat back, glaring at Ethan with barely concealed fury. But for the first time, she had no quick retort. She knew she was cornered. Ethan stood tall, his heart pounding. This wasn't the end of the fight, but it was the beginning of something new. For the first time in years, he felt like he was in control, not of the company, but of his purpose. Whatever happened next, he was ready. Ethan left the boardroom, his steps steady, but his mind racing. The battle with the board wasn't over, but for now, he had the upper hand. He could still feel the tension in the room, the way Victoria's face had hardened as she realized she was losing control. The company was on the edge of a reckoning, and everyone knew it. But this fight wasn't just about the board, it was about the people who had been left behind for too long. As he walked onto the factory floor, he felt dozens of eyes turned toward him. Word had spread quickly. The workers knew something was happening, though they didn't yet know exactly what. Ethan caught sight of Maya and Luis, both looking at him with curiosity and a hint of suspicion. Maya stepped forward, crossing her arms. "What's going on? Everyone's saying you just marched into the boardroom like you own the place." Ethan took a deep breath. He had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, the weight of it felt immense. "Because I used to," he said, meeting her gaze. "I'm Ethan Hayes, the CEO." The room fell into stunned silence. Maya's eyes widened, her mouth opening slightly as if to say something, but no words came out. Luis stared at him, his mop frozen mid-swipe. "Wait," Maya said finally, her voice sharp. "You're telling me that all this time you've been pretending, watching us struggle, listening to our problems like some kind of spy?" Ethan winced at the accusation, but he held his ground. "I wasn't pretending to care," he said. "I needed to see what was really happening. I needed to understand what I'd let this place become." "And what did you learn?" Luis asked quietly, his voice heavy with disappointment. Ethan looked around the room, taking in the faces of the workers who had opened up to him, shared their stories, and trusted him without knowing who he was. "I learned that I failed you," he said simply. "I learned that I lost sight of what mattered, and now I'm trying to make it right." Maya shook her head, her eyes narrowing. "Words aren't enough. Do you have any idea what we've been through? What it's like to work here every day wondering if the machines are going to break down, if we're going to get hurt, if we're even going to make it to the end of the month?" "I do now," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with regret. "And I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm asking for your help." Maya stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she said, "Help with what?" "With fixing this," Ethan said, gesturing to the factory around them. "With holding the board accountable, with making this company what it should have been all along. I can't do it alone." Luis stepped forward, his face thoughtful. And how do we know this isn't just another empty promise? How do we know you're not going to turn your back on us again? Ethan met his gaze, his voice firm. Because I already lost everything, my title, my reputation, the trust of people I care about. I'm not here to protect myself. I'm here to make sure none of you have to go through this anymore. There was a long silence, the air thick with tension. Then, to Ethan's surprise, Ryan stepped into the room, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "He's telling the truth," Ryan said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "I've seen the evidence. I've seen him put himself on the line. If you don't believe him, believe this. He's the only shot we've got at turning this place around." The workers exchanged glances, murmurs rippling through the crowd. Maya's expression softened slightly, though she still looked wary. "What exactly do you want from us?" she asked. "I want your voices," Ethan said. "I want your stories, your experiences. The board needs to see what's really happening here, not just in reports, but from you. If we stand together, they can't ignore us." Luis nodded slowly. "And if they try?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then we'll make them listen." The murmur of voices grew louder, the workers exchanging uncertain but hopeful looks. Maya finally stepped forward, her expression hard but determined. "All right," she said. "But if you let us down again, it's over. For good." "I won't," Ethan promised. Later that day, Ethan and Ryan worked together to organize a meeting with the workers. They gathered in the break room, the space packed with people standing shoulder to shoulder. The air buzzed with nervous energy and cautious optimism. Ethan stood at the front of the room, Ryan by his side. "I know you're angry," Ethan began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "You have every right to be. I failed you. I let this company become something I don't even recognize. But I'm here now, and I'm ready to fight for you." The crowd was silent, their expressions guarded. Ethan continued, his voice steady. "The board wants to keep you quiet. They think they can sweep this under the rug like they always have. But I've seen what you go through. I've worked alongside you. And I know that if we stand together, we can make this company better for all of us." Maya raised her hand, her voice cutting through the room. "What happens if they refuse? If they try to fire us or shut us down?" Ethan nodded. "Then we make sure the world knows what's happening here. We have the evidence, we have the truth, and we have each other. That's more than they can handle." The room erupted into murmurs again, but this time there was a spark of hope in the air. Ethan felt it too, a small but growing sense that they could do this, that this time things might actually change. As the meeting ended, Ethan caught Maya's eye. She gave him a small nod, not quite forgiveness, but something close. It was enough to keep him going. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, Ethan didn't feel like he was fighting alone. The day of the showdown arrived like a storm on the horizon. The workers gathered outside the corporate headquarters, their numbers growing by the minute. Ethan stood at the front, flanked by Maya, Luis, and Ryan. A mix of nerves and determination coursed through him as he scanned the crowd. Faces that had once been weary and defeated now looked resolute, fueled by a newfound sense of solidarity. The scene was unlike anything the company had ever witnessed. Workers held signs painted hastily the night before, "Safety over profits. We are not numbers. Fix what's broken." Their voices rose together, chanting in unison, a rhythmic pulse of anger and hope. The sound echoed off the towering glass building, piercing through the usual sterile quiet of corporate power. Ethan felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about reclaiming his company. This was about reclaiming its soul. Inside the boardroom, the executives watched the growing crowd from behind tinted windows. The tension was palpable as Victoria Kane paced the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She tried to project her usual confidence, but her clenched fists betrayed her. "This is a circus," she snapped, glaring at the other board members. "We cannot allow this to continue." One of the directors, a nervous man with thinning hair, cleared his throat. "They have evidence, Victoria, real evidence. If this goes public—" "It won't," Victoria cut him off, her tone icy. "I'll handle it." The door opened and Ethan walked in, accompanied by Ryan and Maya. Their presence silenced the room. Ethan's posture was calm, but his eyes burned with intensity. He carried the binder under his arm, the weight of its contents heavier than ever. Victoria's lips curled into a mocking smile. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "Decided to join us again, I see." Ethan ignored her, placing the binder on the table. "This ends today," he said, his voice steady and clear. "The lies, the negligence, the greed, it all ends now." Victoria laughed coldly. "And how exactly do you plan to make that happen?" "You're not in charge anymore." "No," Ethan admitted, "but they are." He gestured toward the window where the chants of the workers echoed faintly. "The people you've ignored, the people you've endangered, they're not going to be silent anymore." One of the board members leaned forward, his expression uneasy. "What is it you want, Ethan?" Ethan straightened, his voice firm. "I want accountability. I want immediate action to address the safety violations, the neglected equipment, and the unethical practices that have been swept under the rug. And I want this company to start putting its people first. No more excuses, no more shortcuts." Victoria scoffed. "You think we're just going to hand over control because you made a scene?" Ethan met her gaze, unflinching. "You don't have a choice. The reports are already with the press. The workers are ready to strike. And I'm not going anywhere until this company changes." The boardroom fell into tense silence. Some members shifted uncomfortably, while others avoided Victoria's glare. Finally, one of the older directors, a woman with a calm but commanding presence, spoke up. "He's right," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "If this goes public, we're finished. The shareholders will demand answers, and we'll lose everything." Victoria's expression hardened, but she didn't argue. She could see the writing on the wall. Ethan pressed forward. "This isn't just about avoiding scandal. This is about doing the right thing. This company has a chance to be something better, something we can all be proud of. But it starts here, with this decision." The board members exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. Finally, the older director nodded. "We'll agree to your terms," she said, "but there's one condition." Ethan tensed. "What is it?" "You come back," she said simply. "This company needs leadership, someone who understands what's at stake, someone who's earned the trust of the people." The room went quiet as all eyes turned to Ethan. He felt the weight of their words, the enormity of what they were asking. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he thought of Maya, Luis, Ryan, and all the workers who had fought beside him. This wasn't just about him anymore. "All right," he said finally, "but things will be different. Starting today." Hours later, the factory floor erupted in cheers as word spread of the board's decision. Workers hugged one another, their faces lit with hope and relief. Ethan stood at the center, surrounded by the people who had carried him through this journey. Maya approached him, her arms crossed, but a small smile tugging at her lips. "You actually did it," she said, her tone half teasing, half amazed. "We did it," Ethan corrected. "This was never just about me." Luis clapped him on the back, his grin wide. "Don't let it go to your head, boss. You've got a lot of work ahead of you." Ethan laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in years. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Ryan stepped up, his usual smirk replaced with something softer. "Don't screw it up," he said, his voice quiet, but sincere. Ethan nodded. "I won't." As the crowd began to disperse, Ethan looked around at the factory. The noise, the smells, the energy. It all felt different now. There was still so much to do, but for the first time, he felt like they were on the right path. He turned toward the workers, raising his voice to address them one last time. "This is just the beginning," he said. "We've got a lot to fix, but we're going to do it together. I promise you that." The cheers rose again, filling the air with a sense of unity and hope. Ethan felt a deep sense of purpose settle in his chest. He had lost everything, but in doing so, he had found something far more valuable. As he walked through the crowd, shaking hands and listening to stories, he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just redemption. It was a new beginning, for the company, for the workers, and for himself. In the end, Ethan Hayes realized that losing everything was the only way to find what truly mattered. The journey had humbled him, stripped away the layers of pride and detachment that had blinded him for years. Through the voices of the workers, the pain of their struggles, and the unity forged in shared purpose, he rediscovered the heart of the company he had built. It was never about profits or power, it was about people. The company transformed, but so did Ethan. He became a leader who listened, who walked the factory floor not as a CEO, but as an equal. The workers weren't just employees anymore. They were partners, stakeholders, in a shared vision of fairness and accountability. Ethan's redemption wasn't in reclaiming his title, but in earning back trust brick by brick. This story reminds us that leadership is not about control, but compassion. Real change begins when we face our failures, listen to those we've overlooked, and commit to doing better. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring tales about growth, redemption, and the human spirit. Let's keep this conversation going. Your voice matters.